Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Level Up podcast, where we talk to some of the brightest engineering and DevOps leaders about what it takes to build great products, teams, and companies. I'm your host, Ken Rose. And today is a little bit of a different episode. I'm here with my co-founder and CEO of OpsLevel, John Laban. John and I have known each other for 10 years. And we started OpsLevel together about 4 years ago. OpsLevel is a service ownership platform that lets engineering teams catalog, standardize, and create new services. Before starting OpsLevel, John was the very first employee at PagerDuty back in 2011, and him and I worked together there also for many years. And before PagerDuty, John was a senior engineer at Amazon. So we're going to be chatting with John today about that journey and his observations on scaling teams and systems. So John, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here on your podcast. Thanks for inviting me.
On our podcast,
on
I guess,
our
right?
Podcast, yeah, exactly. You should. Do you? I haven't these are fairly new. Do you? You should drink beers and make it casual like that. You should call it
yeah, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, I guess.
Yeah, whiskey and it needs a nice name that has a drink name and a thing, right? Like Scotch and SRE or something. You should have something like that. I like that.
But yeah,
it's great to be here, and happy to talk about my experiences. And honestly, we've a lot of our experiences have overlapped a fair bit, right? So we can probably get into some of that too.
Yeah. Well, why don't we start way back at the very beginning? You and I went to the same school, and then you graduated, and then you started Amazon. Talk to us a little bit about your time at Amazon, and then how that turned into PagerDuty.
Yeah, sure. So Amazon, like you said, I started Amazon shortly after graduating. I had worked at a number of other places before Amazon because we went to school together at University of Waterloo, and we did all of these co-ops, right? So we did 6 placements. But even when I had worked at Amazon, so this was back in 2006 kind of era. It was a long time ago, but even then it was a massive engineering organization. They had thousands of engineers, and it was the biggest engineering organization that I had worked at the time. And I was really instructive in a lot of ways, seeing how they built software there. They had to figure out a lot of things a lot earlier than many other companies, just in order to make stuff scale properly. One thing that they had figured out early on is that they had this monolithic piece of software that they had built for their website, their retail website, that they had to figure out how to break that up, and they did. So by the time I got there, they had thousands of these small services. They didn't call them microservices. You might call them that today, but they called it a service-oriented architecture. But they had thousands of these things, and they had actually, while I was there, they finally got to the point where they had actually gotten rid of and actually fully deprecated their old monolith. It was called OBDOS, and they had been able to actually put it in its grave, which I think is kind of rare. I think there's many companies out there that are moving from this breaking up their monolith and moving to microservices architecture, but it's hard to actually get rid of that final
final push.
Monolith. Yeah. So anyway, so I was working in this environment. I was like a senior engineer, eventually as I grew my skills there. But this environment was in which we were you had a bunch of these small services, and they're all communicating over APIs, and anything you needed to do, you can kind of figure out how to do by figuring out how to call the APIs of these other services. And I was in the fraud department, so we were trying to investigate all of these, every single order that went through Amazon, figure out is this someone trying to steal the product or steal money or something, or take over someone's account, or just a normal transaction. And so it was looking for these needles in the haystack, and we needed tons of data from everywhere in the company, to as inputs into figuring out, is this a fraudulent transaction? So it was great for us. We were able to call APIs and the customer data systems, and we're looking at the click stream of every click the person's ever made on the website, and we were looking at every bit of information about this transaction and this person, and everywhere we could get data. And so we would call it APIs of services throughout the company. And so that was super useful. And I think the challenge though with Amazon is that they had grown, and they had grown to the point where they had enabled this kind of distributed architecture, by letting each team be working really super independently. So they would all like, be able to do everything they need to do themselves. And they worked in this kind of like DevOps manner where the team itself would build the software and ship it to production and, go on call for it and be responsible for it.
You build it, you own it, kind of Werner Vogel's 2006 thing. Yeah,
exactly. And so, one of the challenges that you get when you like the benefit of that, of course, is that like each team can work super independently, can work in it. Like they're not blocked on all these other teams to do their job. But the downside is that they're also super siloed. And so they don't really like see the big picture in any way. And they know exactly what they're doing. And they, even us, when we were communicating with all these other services to get data, we knew the existence of those other systems mostly through tribal knowledge and through other people like in our team, like knowing about them. But there wasn't any good like way of discovering any of this stuff. And so what tended to happen like so often was just like the rebuilding of the same stuff over and over. There's so many like duplicate systems that did the same things and are slightly different versions of like the same systems out there. But it all kind of worked because, this giant patchwork, software architecture still kind of kept trooping on, and Amazon is able to like build new functionality, new features, and new entire products, and to keep moving things forward all the time. But yeah, it was just like a lot of like organized chaos, I guess you could say.
Right. Like it sounds like then there wasn't like a ton of like reuse, right, or leverage in that the same service or the same capability was being built several times over just due to lack of knowledge of that other service existing.
Yeah, there was a lot of like of that reuse where people knew about it, and then otherwise they would go rebuild the same thing. Even in my fraud department, I saw like many examples of like the same services being built to solve the same problem, basically, but just on like different teams, and they didn't. Even those two different teams in the same department didn't really talk to each other well enough to like coordinate on that. So there was that happening, but the other part was just like even what data is out there, what services and systems can I even call, and being able to like get the right info when you need it could have been challenging if you don't know where to find this info.
Yeah, I can imagine an architecture with like thousands of services. Like where do you begin with that?
Yeah, exactly. And it's usually purely through tribal knowledge. Like my boss or my other peers on my team would point me in the right direction, and then I could go from there. But if I didn't know about them, I'd be stuck.
Right. And then, so you were at Amazon for a few years, and then you ultimately joined the founders of PagerDuty. Can you talk to us a little bit about that transition?
Sure. Yeah. So the founders of PagerDuty, they actually worked at Amazon alongside me, and we knew each other pretty well. And everybody at Amazon was working in a very like DevOps type manner before that was a term, but it was a very you build it, you own it type manner where every team was was shipping their new code and their software and their new product features or whatever it was to production, and they were going on call for it, and they were setting up monitoring and logging and everything they needed to do. And there was a lot of tooling that Amazon had built. They had the not invented here syndrome, where they would kind of like build everything themselves. Many times because they had to, because like nobody else was dealing with issues at that scale. But one of the things that they had built was like internal software to help manage on call. Like we were this is Seattle in like 2010 or whatever, but we're still walking around with pagers on our belt back then, which was kind of ridiculous. And we were like, if you saw someone else in Seattle with a pager, you knew that they worked at Amazon. But they had software to manage this on-call handoff between the different members of your dev team and to do the actual paging and everything of people. And eventually it started supporting like cell phones and stuff too. But the founders of PagerDuty, I guess they saw the fact that Amazon had to build this kind of like internal tooling, and they had seen the same things at like Google and some other big companies out there. And they figured, it's, why are big companies building this and like small companies can't, or they don't have the ability to build this specialized tooling, but they have the same problems. And so, they decided to build this product, PagerDuty, and sell it as like a SaaS tool for everybody, and help with this transition of like, helping developers go on call and owning their services end to end.
Nice. Now you started as their first employee, right? And so
Yep.
as a developer, like you had your hands in the dirt writing code, but as the company grew, you changed into management. What were some of the challenges that came out, because Pager experienced, I mean, they're a public company now, like meteoric growth. Uh, Talk to us about some of the challenges in scaling that Android.
Yeah. So yeah, I started there as a first employee. Like shortly after they'd gone through Y Combinator, and man, there's millions of challenges, right, we could talk about, because like it was 4 people when I started, and we had grown quite substantially over the years to like many hundreds, and during that transition, I would say like there's all these different like phases of transition. Even at the start, like we were figuring out like how to hire people, how to manage them, how to grow them, and that's like part of my transition into management, is just because we didn't like know how to hire managers, so I started doing it. But yeah, I would say like there's all these inflection points. Probably what works at 4 people doesn't work anymore when you're at 20 people, and what works at 20 people doesn't work when you're like 60, or 60 doesn't work when you're 200. And there's all these like inflection points where the company has to change pretty dramatically, and you might look back like every year, and then the company might be a pretty different. It may be an entirely different company, like as to what it looked like a year ago. So like, yeah, there was like tons of things we had to learn about communication and being more like deliberate with communication. I mean, Ken, you've seen that even so far at OpsLevel, we've changed pretty differently. Now we're
For sure.
50, and there's been a big change as we've grown. But yeah, like even how we built software had to change pretty dramatically over the years. Like we started with the monolith at PagerDuty, just like I think is actually a pretty smart way to start. A piece of software is like monolithic, so you can move quickly and change things quickly, and like I don't know, fundamentally change your data model if you need to, and your early days of a startup. And but over time we did start, as we needed to scale, we started breaking things up into smaller pieces, and moving ownership onto teams and things. We did a few big transformations as we grew. Like one of them was an agile transformation, because when we first started splitting up, we did it in a pretty naive way. I think we don't have to get too much into this, but like we started by if we had one engineering team, now we're gonna have 2. Maybe we should break it up into like a back end team and a front end team, and then maybe another like ops team or something.
Right. And that kind of makes sense when you're small, like there's not, any real scale.
Yeah. And like it would break up by skill set and like tool set knowledge and stuff like that. And it kind of worked, except every single feature had to go through like three teams, and they all had all these dependencies on each other, and everything got slow to build, and everything was always late. And so, we to make that better, we made some mistakes in the early days, and we tried to get better and better at software estimation, and make sure that we're able to like super figure out exactly what we're going to build before we even decide to build it, and then estimate exactly how long it's going to take. And so it led us into like super over designing things, but also being super conservative in terms of our approach, and being very rigid in terms of like what we were building to, because like, hey, we had spec'd this out 4 months ago, and we can't change it. So like we went kind of far down that route until it was like there was a point at which I was made VP of engineering for a while, because our CTO was focusing more on product at the time. And I think we were only around like 50 engineers at the time, but I decided to do this kind of shakeup of like how we built software, and it was pretty big. I think you were there at the time for sure, right, Ken? It was because you had joined when we were like 20.
I think so, yeah.
Like total. So this was like when we first started creating these cross-functional teams that would have front-end engineers and back-end engineers, and they would be tasked with like building some specific feature or a product, and they do it kind of end to end, or at least like the whole feature, and they wouldn't have as many outside blockers, right? Or outside dependencies. And there certainly was only one team that was like building a certain product feature. So that worked like pretty great in terms of not having all these different dependencies. And we also switched how we built, so it was a lot more incremental and a lot more iterative, right. And start with a skateboard and grow from there. But okay, so there was like new problems that happened. Those teams, they were, what do you call that style where where the team is just given like a project and then they, like,
Oh, Kanban?
well, next month they might work on a completely different project. Yeah, they're
Not
kind
Kanban,
of like
Scrum.
well, I don't remember the term for it, but like you can think of it like A, B, C kind of teams where they could really be repurposed to do anything. The challenge,
like fungible, kind of like.
well, yeah, the challenge was that like who is actually owning all the services and systems and the things that were like the artifacts, the stuff that was the software that was getting built.
Right.
It wasn't those teams because they might work on every time they built a feature, they might touch some services over here and then some new feature, some services entirely over here, because they might be entirely different product domains that they were working on.
Right.
And so under the covers, we built out this like SRE model. They weren't called SRE at the time. It was like, I think called a real-time team, but it was kind of like a SRE model where there was these teams that were responsible for actually running all of the services, and they own those services. But they were responsible for more than just like the operations around them. They actually like, they would contribute a lot of code to the services, but specifically around like the reliability of the services, the scalability. And they would also approve like all changes that were being made by these product development teams from the scope of like, is this scalable? Are you doing it in a performant way? That kind of stuff, right? Or does this fit like the
long-term architecture? Yeah. Or like the scaling goals. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of working, except, it was just like, it was causing that throw over the wall. Like the product teams were focused on just building product, and the SRE style teams were focused on like, you're not doing it right. And I want you to like be making me get paged more, because there's the SRE teams that were going on call.
Right.
And we, I think one way to have gone forward from there would have been to start establishing things like, error budgets and all of that style of thing. But what we ended up doing was more of a full DevOps style transformation, which is like the second transformation, where again kind of exploded everything and reshaped these end-to-end product development teams to not just be like front-end code, back-end code around the feature, but also all the operations as well.
Right.
And they actually own the systems too. So we had to like move ownership of these services to a specific subset of each, of the services to each team. So those teams actually had to own software, which was different. Before these product development teams, they didn't have to like actually go,
they could kind of build it and like be done with it. Yeah.
Yeah. But now they were designing the feature, building out the feature, deploying it to production, and then, making sure it had the right kind of monitoring and logging and observability, and it was scalable, and it didn't have all sorts of like, bad database queries or whatever they needed to do. And they would also get paged if things broke. And so everybody was on pager duty, which was weird because before that, like only a small subset of people were actually using pager duty, like internally. And so, yeah, that was actually really great to really unlock, like it removed all of those, what's that agile term for like blockers? They have this specific term they're always using, but blockers are like making sure you don't have dependencies on other teams as little as possible. You don't want these dependencies on other teams, because then it's like these checkpoints that slow you down.
Right.
So that was like really, really good. But it was the difficult part with thinking through that ownership model was like, okay, we had to move SREs, like these people with that right kind of skill set onto each team. It wasn't like embedded. It was like they were literally on the team going forward. But you also had to make sure that that you would move ownership of the services to the teams, and that meant that these teams they couldn't just work on whatever the hell feature you wanted next. You had to like break up your product domains.
Kind of, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you had to break up your product domains into specific domains, and you had to move give them kind of ownership, not just over a set of like services, but over like this part of your product, right?
Right.
And so, there was a lot of thinking going into it, but once we were able to like, set up that structure, it worked well for at least a couple of years before you had to kind of do it again. But yeah.
Okay. So if I can summarize, it was the early days was you had teams basically formed around discipline, back end, front end, ops.
Yeah.
And the challenge there was, okay, like any feature threaded through all three teams. So then I was like, hey, cool, let's have cross-functional teams. That stopped the threading and all the blockers from there. But then the challenge really was like continuity and ownership. Like a team built something and then they kind of threw it over the fence.
Yeah.
The real-time team existed as like, okay, sort of this pseudo SRE thing to 10 to the software in production, but that still wasn't great. There was a dev versus ops or dev versus SRE mindset. So then that was the DevOps transformation. The true you build it, you own it, where teams are aligned to a particular slice of the product domain.
Exactly. That worked pretty well, but like I said, every year the company is kind of at this different stage because it was growing so fast. And even then, it wasn't their nirvana. There was lots of other challenges that happened as you grew. So I can tell you the next stage was, once you give all these teams all this autonomy and ownership, and they were able to kind of build systems, own them end to end. You want to give them that autonomy at the same time so that they can make decisions on their own and they can move quickly. But we got to the point where, you couldn't really tell this going in, but after a while you could see things really slowing down. And the reason was, each of these teams over time, they would build up all of this. It's not technical debt, not in the sense of, we're on a few versions behind of this framework, and if we moved forward, we could move faster. It was technical debt in terms of all of these competing technologies that all did the same thing, and each team had to know them all. So over time, especially after another reorg, for instance, that we did to realign the product domains, you'd have teams that have to know 5 programming languages to do their job, right? And
right,
just because over time, the team, you're on the team and you start adding tech, and then maybe a reorg happens 2 years later, and so services might move around at that time, and people move around and stuff, and you get to the point where every team has to know a ton of competing technology, so competing programming languages, competing frameworks.
Totally.
We were using this seems ridiculous, but there was even competing container orchestrators.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah. It wasn't Kubernetes even. It was 2 other ones that we were using.
I remember. Well, and in fairness, this was 2015. Kubernetes had just come out. But I remember there was a group of people who loved all the HashiCorp products. So Nomad, they were really happy for Nomad. Mesos also was super hot at the time. And then also Kubernetes, was clearly emerging as a winner.
So I think we were thinking of adding a third container orchestrator, which is
pretty much.
And then so you have all these teams, many of them have to know all these duplicate stuff. So it's all this cognitive overhead. So the next step, we had to kind of sit together. I mean, you were there for some of that too, figuring out how do we get more leverage? How do we kind of reduce this cognitive overhead? How do we get to a critical mass of people that are all know this tech so well that they're that they can move really quickly within it? And so there's a lot we had to do to try to make that better. But that I would say that went into us seeing how tools like OpsLevel, before it existed, how other companies were dealing with this problem too, and how they in this transition of what it means to own a service, there's this concept of the standardization to some degree, or certain best practices on tooling. So at PagerDuty, we started trying to roll up here's a standard set of A, B, and C that we should try to get everybody using, especially for new things. We had no way of measuring that too. It was really difficult to actually, anytime you're trying to roll out something new, even if you're trying to move everybody to Kubernetes, for instance, just when you have dozens, hundreds of services, trying to figure out which services have moved yet and which haven't.
Right.
And it was
I remember many Confluence pages with many lists, all of which were at some point outdated, right, for different migrations that we had on the go there.
Yeah, for sure. But it was worth doing. It was just hard to do, and it was definitely a huge learning experience. Every stage the company got through, there was new scaling challenges, both in terms of communication, in terms of how we built software, and of course the standard scaling challenges of our software not scaling, which was fun. But
right, the users are using too much, and what are the performance bottlenecks that kind of emerge when that happens?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think they ever hit nirvana when you left, or do you think that
No,
what do you think that and what is that nirvana end state? What should that be?
I mean, I don't know if there's ever like an end state. It's just like I think a good practice is to just be trying to continuously improve and just trying to always get better, because it's very context dependent as well. Like, as the company grows and changes, like what worked last year or what you figured out last year actually might not be the right answer anymore. And maybe something that worked earlier might now be the right answer, or something that didn't work earlier might now be the right answer. So like, I'd hesitate to say that there is some like final nirvana, but like you want to get to the state where people are able to move quickly. And a lot of that has to, like, in terms of writing software, a lot of that has to do with just like not having both these external dependencies, but like internal baggage, as they those things, both of those types of things can slow you down. And so you have to try to minimize both. So yeah, anyway, like that, not to pitch OpsLevel specifically, but it did go into our like deciding to build OpsLevel, just seeing like what we were dealing with, and then like what the other companies out there in the same boat were dealing with, and or like how they tried to solve the problem already, and they were building all this internal tools out there in the world trying to solve this exact kind of problem. Just getting the visibility into what services and systems existed, and then like having some degree of visibility and then standardization on how we're building systems.
Right.
Yeah.
What, I mean, a few years ago now, right? You've stepped in this role, you're the CEO at OpsLevel. Is there any sort of thing different today about scaling teams or scaling businesses than from your experience, years ago at PagerDuty?
I mean, it's hard for me to answer that directly because, a lot of, I think it's my focus now as CEO has been a lot more on the go-to-market side of things, like sales and marketing and support and success. And I think it's a lot harder to build a SaaS business now than it was in the PagerDuty era. And in many ways, that a lot of that has to do with increasing security and compliance concerns that are being asked by the market. And so like we have to be a lot more cognizant of that in terms of how we build our software internally, and that we're doing it like in a way that is compliant with various things, so that we can then sell it to all of these these customers that are very security and compliance focused.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's been hard, but I would almost turn the question to you, because like you're as CTO, you're running the engineering team. So like do you find there's other areas in which like it's harder now than it was then, or it's different now than it was then?
It's an interesting question. Similar. Okay, so I think there's two parts to that. One of them is like, no, a lot of the challenges of growing your company are people challenges. They're challenges around alignment, communication, leverage. How do you keep this growing set of humans all pointing in the same direction and doing the right things? That happens at PagerDuty, that happens at OpsLevel, that happens at like every company that's scaling. And you're right, you have different inflection points as you go from 4 to 40 to 400. A lot of it is just like how you communicate. And when you're really small, that communication is easy because you can just get in a room and talk about things. When you're larger, you have to be more explicit about like, okay, here are the goals. Here's a specific, like for a feature, like here's why we're building this. Here's the problem that we think it solves. But just getting everybody aligned on what those things are before you go ahead and execute. I think I agree. Like, I think security and compliance comes up a whole lot more now than it did 10 years ago. But I think also the market has responded. There's also like 1,001 different SOC 2 vendors. I love ours, like they're great. And they help automate a lot of things. So I think there are increased demands, but there's also like increased tooling that's helped, catch up to those increased demands.
Yeah, for sure.
This may be a personal question for you, John, because we've been at this, a few years now. But what are the customer stories that get you up in the morning and kind of like keep you focused on OpsLevel?
Maybe I won't name any specific names just because it's like I haven't talked to them about this. But what I like is what I especially enjoy is seeing these themes across customers that are just resonating, and like we see so many customers coming to us with a very similar subset of problems. And I love like hearing them, that they're hard problems. They're coming to us and asking around like, we just have no visibility into like what services and systems form our product. And these are like critical things that like our whole product is running on, and they're running our whole business, but we don't actually know what's out there. And we need to have this need for ownership around them, but there's no clear, it's just in people's heads, like who owns what. And so that's like one fundamental problem here. And the other is like, we want to let people move quickly and build software quickly, but also do it the right way and with certain standards. And we have, we need to be able to like measure and drive improvements in these, but we have no visibility. So like I just hearing these same problems like resonate, and people come to us with these hard problems that they don't have solutions to, and we have this great solution to it, like, and that we can just like help them solve that problem directly. It's been that's what keeps me going, and like that's why I love what we're doing and what we're building. And it's like I feel like it's solving a problem that didn't have a good solution. There just wasn't any solution out there around.
100%. Yeah, I have the same thing. Like when we get a customer, they're like talking about the challenges. We have all these services, or we don't know who owns what, and they're just describing them. I'm pattern matching. Like I've heard this, I've seen this movie. I've seen it like 100 times before for all of our customers. And there's that like feeling like I can help you. I have value. Like I can help. The thing we've made here at OpsLevel is going to help solve that problem. That's the best thing. And even better is when they start telling you about problems that they have that you don't solve, and you keep hearing those problems from other customers. Like this is where we're going. Like this is the next step for us, right? That's also, I don't know, it's super energizing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I just want to keep at it and keep growing that set of customers that have these problems. But also as we solve them, I love like solving them together and learning from these customers and continuing to iterate and because this problem space is like, it's a fairly new problem space. It's something over the last decade in a lot of ways. And, we're still solving it actively with our customers' guidance.
Yeah. On the topic, kind of like new value, one thing we recently launched here at OpsLevel is service creation, the ability for product developers and teams to self-serve and actually create a new running service in production, get a templated repo set up with all the best practices already installed. Maybe can you share a little bit about what's next for OpsLevel?
Yeah. So OpsLevel, we're going to keep going in that direction in a lot of ways. Like we want to help platform engineering teams enable their product developers to move faster, right? And give platform engineering teams more leverage. And like I said, like let their product engineers move faster, build services faster, build systems faster, and do it without having to be blocked and waiting on infrastructure. And so, yeah, it's just gonna be definitely more in that direction. Build services more quickly, but build them in the right way. Make sure that you've got a lot of the reliability and security practices baked in as much as possible and automated as much as possible, so you don't have to like push a lot of that know-how to every single developer team.
100%. So before we wrap up, something I ask all guests, and John, I guess I'll ask you. And actually, I don't think I know the answer to this one, so I'm actually interested. But what is your favorite music to listen to, like when you're working or when you want to have focus?
Yeah, it's a funny question. I actually I don't listen to music at all when I'm working. I find it super distracting. Like maybe it's just me and my head's broken that way, but I like focus on the music a whole bunch, and I like it. I just can't basically. I used to a little bit when I was programming in the early days, and I think the only thing I could do was like music without lyrics. Maybe something quick, like I don't know, like this was like a long time ago, but like trance music or something like that, where it would just be like fast paced and no lyrics at all. But otherwise, it's way too distracting. Nowadays, though, I don't know. I don't, in terms of listening to music in general, like I have, young kids. So a lot of like Disney soundtracks probably, is the average.
Shrek is making its way through our household with my kids.
Nice. Well, yeah. That's at least it's like actual, decent.
It's a little more poppy.
Music,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, listen, everyone feel free to follow John specifically on LinkedIn. You can find him John Laban, follow OpsLevel on Twitter at OpsLevelHQ. I'd like to thank all of our listeners for listening in today. And John, thank you again for joining us. If you have any, for the audience, if there's any topics or guests that you'd like to see on the show, please send us an email to levelup@opslevel.com. And we'll see everybody next time. Happy building.
Thank you.